Hello and welcome to another one of my Worklight how-to videos. This is focused on Worklight 6.1, but the same concept applies for either earlier versions of Worklight or even the latest version 6.2. And this is really focused on how to build your Worklight application for production. And it could be for production or for tests, basically for something that is non-development or non-sitting on a developer's workstation. And so if we take a second to take a look at how a development or the development processes that are there for a Worklight application, there's three distinct phases. There's development, test, and production. Sounds simple. Every application goes through this. I've also heard the terms of N for production, N plus 1 for test, which means it's one generation newer than what's going to be in production, or N plus 2 for development, meaning that there are two generations or two iterations away from this going out to production. However you want to term these, they're still the same basic concept of, to actually develop this application, you have a developer sit down on a workstation, on a laptop, and they actually will code the application. They'll use, if they're building a hybrid application, they're going to use JavaScript, they're going to use HTML, CSS, jQuery Dojo, whatever other things to build this application using Worklight. That's great and wonderful. If they also take advantage, or as part of your architecture, you want to take advantage of direct update, which is a really cool feature provided by Worklight that allows you to ensure that everyone who's running your application is running it at a specific level. You can also disable the application. You can send out messages to everybody who tries to start the application. It's got some really neat function in it. Or if you want to connect to the Worklight server to access adapters, and whether those are SQL, HTTP, cast iron, custom created adapters, if you want to use that concept of having a single point of entry for your mobile application, either one of those techniques or any other reason why you would want your mobile device or your mobile application to connect into a Worklight server, you will need to follow this. If you're using Worklight to create just a standalone mobile application or a mobile application that does not connect into a Worklight application, and I've been on projects where we've done those, then you really can basically skip this video and go on to something else. So for those who remain, again, from a developer's workstation, they've got Eclipse, they've got the developer's version of Worklight, they've got their browser, they're coding and doing their testing on their browser. Some may actually have a mobile device that they plug in through a USB port on their laptop and actually sending the code over there to test, and everything's going great and wonderful. It's when you move it over into a test environment where you're looking at something closer to what's actually going to be there in production, where you actually have a WebSphere server that's running Worklight that may also be supporting some other REST APIs that the adapters talk to. There's also a DB2 or some other database that's holding on to the Worklight DB information. And your testers could be coming in through a browser or a mobile device. When coming in through a browser, you're going to come in and run the device simulator that's on the or the Worklight server. It's going to look a little different than the one that's there on the developer's version of Worklight, but still will behave basically the same. It just won't look like you're actually running on a mobile device. When you're coming in through that route, Worklight already knows the address of the Worklight server because that's where you launch the browser from. When you're coming in from a mobile device, and this is the interesting part, unless you do something different in how you build that mobile device from how the developer did, it's actually going to point back to the developer's workstation possibly, or could possibly point to whatever machine built the or generated the source file, which is not good. Again, when you get into production, you'll have the same issue where everyone's going to be coming in from a mobile device, and if it's still pointing off to a the developer's workstation, chances are it's going to fail because if they came in through a VPN, there's probably firewalls between there. And plus, you don't want your developer's workstation to be the central point of all production activity. So to do this, Worklight has a setting that you put when you actually generate the source that tells it where to go and look for the URL for the Worklight server that you want to contact. Now, if we take a look at what a hybrid application looks like in Worklight, and this is a really high level view of it, but you have your native shell and you have your web code. Now, whether that's a hybrid mix or a hybrid web app, doesn't matter. Inside here, your web code, this is your WLAPP file, your Worklight application file. It has your JavaScript, it has your HTML, your CSS, your images, JSON files, anything you need to actually that your developer is generating it, except for any native code that they might write. So if they wrote some custom Cordova applications, then that Cordova code and the Cordova XML files would not be in the WLAPP file. The code, JavaScript code calling the Cordova functions would be. Now in a native shell part of the application is where you have, of course, the Worklight runtime and the Cordova runtimes, where it actually takes the WLAPP file contents and converts them into what looks like a native application and gives you access to the native APIs. It also has any of the Cordova plugins that you may have developed or any custom code that you wrote at the device level. Also, Worklight puts in there, depending upon the environment, a configuration file that gives that shell or that application information about where Worklight is and some other settings. In an iOS environment, that's called worklight.plist. In Android, it's wlclient.properties. There's a similar file for BlackBerry and Windows Mobile. Inside that file, it will actually have the URL that it needs to go to talk to Worklight. Okay, now I've written a simple jQuery program to demonstrate this. Now the program is very complex, and I'm a very sarcastic person. There is one button in the application. You can see it up here in the editor for index.html. And when you click on that button, it's going to call a method called pressMe. So if I go over here to my JavaScript, pressMe, and what I've done, it does call an adapter. I have a controller that I copied over from another project I had done where I put some wrapper around calling an adapter so that I can make sure that it has some logging in there that I like looking at. But just go on faith that this controller call adapter really does call an adapter. And so I'm calling an adapter called SomeAdapter, get environment. So I'm not passing any parameters, and if it goes well, it's going to call environment successful. If it fails, it's going to call get environment failed. If it's successful, it pops up a message box that returns whatever the result is in the message box, saying I talked to whatever server. And we can take a quick look at the adapter itself, and let's look at the implementation code. Again, this is real complex stuff, but I'm just trying to prove a point here. So when you call it, it's going to return dev. Now I have another copy of this same exact adapter that's sitting on a different server that returns the word server. So that way we'll know which machine it's pointing to when we run the application. So if I go back and I run this application now, and I come over here to my local host, you can see local host, I bring up the browser simulator. It's got the button in there that says press me. So if I press it, the JavaScript code calls the adapter, which turns around and returns the information which says I'm talking to a development server. If I go to my other server, which is XenoTP, and I bring up the simulator there, and I click on the press me, it calls the adapter that's there on that other machine and says, okay, I'm talking to the production server. So this way we'll know by that message which server it's talking to. So if I go down and I go back to the code here, and I go to my application, And when you normally build your hybrid application, you come down, you click on run and run on development server, and you can see it goes off and it actually starts building the source code or generating the source code at this time for your application. And you can see it even kicks off the Android compiler, and so it's done. You can also come down, if you're doing iPhone, and do a right mouse on just the iPhone project if you want to generate the source code and build just for the iPhone. And I stress that you're generating the source at this point, because if you go in and you actually do the work to put in the right IP address, or excuse me, the right URL pointing off to the Worklight server, and then you come in to run as, and you go to Xcode project, it's actually going to regenerate the source code and it's going to point off to your development server on your local machine. So again, you want to be careful when you're doing it. So when you're doing it for development, if I'm a developer doing that iPhone, kicking off Xcode is a wonderful thing. I can come over here to Xcode. It's got the project up. I can look at the Worklight plist that I mentioned earlier, and you can see it's got hard-coded in there this machine's URL. And if I run it, I'll bring up the simulator here. It should, when I click on that press me button, say that it's pointing off to development server, because that's where that plist file is pointing to. And that's where it's pointing to. So I'm talking to development server. Yay, great and wonderful. That's not what we want in production. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to show you how to build this so it can go onto a production or a test server. And there's two ways. One is similar to what you do normally when you're in the development process. So I'm going to do a right mouse on the hybrid app, come down to run, and normally this is, we'd select run on Worklight development server, build it and run, test, and we're good. There's a couple other options down here. There's the build settings and deploy target. So go to that one first. Now since I've done this before, remember the selections, but when you first come in here, it's going to look like this. So what you'll want to do is you'll want to click on the build the application to work on a different server, or if you wanted to, you can come up here and if you had other servers defined, you could say okay, pull down, if you go to your production server or your test server, have that defined, and it'll point off to those. With the projects I've done, we've not had the luxury of being able to have access to the Worklight console to deploy into test or even into production. So we have to build it as a separate step. So I go to build here and I put in the server's URL. So http://xenotp:1080. Context path is some application. If you want to, because I have run into where this is too short, I think it's like 30 characters or 32 characters they give you. You can put all this on one line and it'll still break it out correctly into the property files. Either way. So I've got that done. I'll hit OK. Now all that did was that just saved off that property. So now if I want to build for that server, which we could say it's a test server or production, I come back here and I say build all environments. And by doing this, it's actually going through and it's generating the WLAPP file. It's also generating the source code for me, and it kicks off the builds for the Android, and it also sent the code over into the native area for Xcode. Now I'm going to close Xcode down here. Now before, when I launched Xcode, I went down to here and I said iPhone run as Xcode project. Don't do that at this point. That will rebuild it and overwrite the WLAPP, or excuse me, overwrite the worklight.plist file, which we don't want to have happen here. So what you have to do for iPhone, not for Android. For Android, I can just come down to here to the Android project and run it because Android is integrated into Eclipse. In fact, in here, if I wanted to, under Assets, there's a WL Properties file, which now has, instead of like we looked at the plist file earlier where it had the 192.8 address in there, now it has the address that I put in, the URL that I put in there. One other thing, and I forgot to mention this at the beginning, and I've mentioned this on my other videos, if you are doing a Dojo application and you're putting it out to test or to production, make sure you come over here to this Dojo Library Request tab. Make sure this is turned off. Right now it's turned on, but you want it turned off. And you also want to make sure if there are any files listed in here, you do a right mouse on there and tell it to copy it into the project or into the application. If you do not do that, what will happen is, with this turned on the way it is, if this was a Dojo application, which it's not, it would actually hard code the URL for this laptop that I'm running on into the HTML file. And so when it tries to bring up the application on a mobile device, it'll crash. Or could crash if it can't access your mobile device, or your laptop, because what you're telling it is to, if you can't find a Dojo library, go over to my laptop. And so just always make sure this is turned off. Since I'm doing jQuery, doesn't matter. So anyway, so now I want to go into my Xcode project. So I want to bring up Finder, and this is my workspace test. And then I have some application, go down to apps, hybrid app, iPhone, native. Now there's native and native resources. Anything you put in native resources, when it generates the code, is going to be copied over to native. So it's a good place to put your icons, and if you do some Cordova customization for your own plugins, it's a good place to put them in there. I'll go into native, and then there's my Xcode project file. So I'll open that. Come on, Xcode. There you go. And actually remembered I had the plist file open. So you can see even in the plist file it's now pointing to the new server, so that's good. So I'll close that, and then I'm going to go ahead and run this. And so it should bring up my one push button here, and when I press it, it's now going and talking to the other server, which is good. This is what we want to do. And there is no place in the JavaScript code where you can tell it the URL for the Worklight server. It has to be built into the plist or properties file, depending upon which environment you're going for. Okay, so that's one way to get it in there, is through the UI. Again, that's, if I wanted to rebuild it, I made a change, I wanted to rebuild and put out to have it point that same production, I'd come back, and all I'd have to do is the run build all environments, because it already has it remembered the URL and stuff I put in there. Now that's going to generate the source code. You still have to, for Android, do your normal packaging and stuff to get your APK file. For iOS, you still have to go and generate the IPA file to actually install it, but this makes sure that the source that's generated has the right code in it. Now another way you could build it is if you went through an Ant script. Now for doing an Ant script method, you'll need to have a couple jar files, and those you can get from the Worklight server installation, or the directory it was installed in. And I've copied them to my machine, but there's a Worklight Ant builder jar, Ant deployer, and Ant J2E library. The builder has Ant logic in it, or procedures in it, where it'll actually build applications, war files if I remember right, and adapters. The deployer will actually upload the app adapters and applications, so you can have a whole automated process here. I'm focusing on just building the application. So I've actually created an Ant script, And this I copied straight from the instructions that are out there online for Worklight. Did a task definition pointing off to the Worklight Ant Builder jar. So it goes in, it's going to pull in all those tasks that they've defined. And then I have one target named Go, and it goes off and it's going to build my application. Now there's a few parameters you got to make sure you pass in. The first one is Worklight Server Host. Just like on the one menu that I showed you where you can set the setting in there, here you specify the full URL just on one line. The next is the application folder, which points down to, if you're looking at the stack here, it's where the hybrid application begins. It's where that application descriptor.xml file resides. That's the address you give it there. Native project prefix is used for iOS projects. So you just put in there the name of the Worklight project, which I put some application. Your group may have other requirements to put in there. Output folder is literally where it's going to put the build results. Now when it builds it, it's going to do two things. One, it's going to generate the WLAPP files for you. So you can, again, upload those, use a deployer jar file and put them off into the test or production servers. It's also going to regenerate the source file to have the right information in it. So it'll rebuild this plist file and the other sources. So I can go ahead and actually run it in here. I like using Eclipse. I'm just a fan of it. So I've got the ant file defined there. So I'm going to go ahead and just run the ant file. And it's telling me I'm using the 6.1 version. And it only takes a few seconds to build it. But what it's doing is it's going through and it's regenerating all the source as well. And it took 15 seconds. We can go out and we can look at the directory I put it in, and so it switched over to here. So you can say that they were all built today. And if I was to take that source again and run it, if I come back to here, it's rebuilt all this source. You can see it's still pointing off to the same location. So again, to stress, it is very important when you're building a Worklight application that talks to a Worklight server that you want it to point to the right Worklight server. When you're doing development and test, it's okay, but when you get into a test system and you get into a production system, you want them pointing to the test or to the production respectively. You don't want the code in here when they launch it to try and access back to the developer's workstation. I hope you find this one helpful. I apologize if it seems glitchy. I had a little 3-year-old hop in here once or twice to say hi. So have a good day. Bye bye.